Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits. I have some information on how to get started knitting a hat without a pattern, and I do some forensic analysis on a sock knit by a woman born shortly after the turn of the century. So let's get started. This tidbit came to me on Twitter in a tweet from Sophie Peng, who tweeted a nice long thread about an international wool conference, which was part of Estonian Wool Week. She shared photos showing yarn spun at Tartu University's own wool mill. It seems to be a pattern that some universities are milling their own yarn these days. She shared slides from different talks on topics like the shared genetic heritage of sheep, the links between sheep breeding and human migration, and the decline of the wool industry due to a focus on meat production. So there are a lot of little interesting bits of information in those slides. I'll leave a link to the Twitter thread down below, assuming Twitter survives going forward. There are some really interesting little factoids that might lead you to doing some additional searching on your own. This tidbit came to me from Louise, who sent me an email with a link to Anna Kingstone's blog. So Anna recently acquired a vintage product called MIK, Men in Khaki, Sock Knitter's Help. It was a little kit that you could buy during World War II when you were knitting socks for soldiers. And it had a few different things in the kit, but one of the particular items was a special measuring device. It was about 12 inches long and had a kind of a clip or a hook at one end. And it was a guide for figuring out how long to knit different parts of the sock, depending on which of the four sizes that you wanted to knit. So I did a little searching to see if I could see more examples of this kit, because all that we could see on Anna's website on her blog post was this measuring device. But the kit did come with other things, including instructions on how to knit the sock and then to use the little measuring device. One of the things that I find kind of sort of both interesting but also frustrating about vintage knitting instructions is the focus on casting on a very specific number of stitches, and oftentimes knitting to a very specific number of rows. In the case of these socks, it's knitting to a particular length. But they do this without giving information about what the expected finished size is meant to be, or even what the gauge they're expecting you to get with this stitch count and the yarn that they're specifying. So they might even go so far as recommending a needle size. And they might say, oh, if you're a loose knitter, use a smaller needle, and if you're a tight knitter, go up a needle size. But without the information on what the goal is, the knitter is really left to their own devices in terms of figuring out if they're knitting something correctly. So that's one of the challenges with these vintage patterns, and it's going to be one of the challenges of this new long-term project I'm going to be working on, where I'm going to be knitting a variety of sock patterns from different eras. If you would like to see photos of the complete kit, I found a website that sells prints of what the contents of that kit was, and so you can just take a look at their photo and see all the little bits and bobs that were contained in one of those kits. I'll leave that link down in the show notes. This tidbit is from B.E. Christensen on Ravelry, who sent a link to an article about a woman who has an online business, and she recently added Fair Isle sweaters to her business. So the business sells handmade goods from all over the world. Melissa Ventosa Martin runs Old Stone Trade, and she has partnered with a knitwear designer, Maddie Ventralon, I think is her last name, who lives on Fair Isle and is a knitwear designer. So they partnered together to bring several custom knit Fair Isle designs to the online business. The article was in Financial Times, and I'll leave a link down below. There are just some really beautiful photos of Fair Isle knitwear taken in the Fair Isle countryside. So if you'd love to see what that looks like, it's really nice. And then there are also links to the website if you want to see the kinds of things that she is selling in her business. If you have a tidbit that you'd like to share, you can send me an email. There is a link to my email address on my channel's About page. So from my channel homepage, click on the About tab, and then you can get my email address. Or you can contact me on Ravelry through direct message, or you can start a new discussion thread in my Ravelry group. So I have been knitting hats for the past couple of weeks. I've got all kinds of examples here. And in addition, I've been knitting some partial hats where it's mostly just the crown of a hat. All of this is in preparation for the series I'm going to be doing for Technique Tuesday on hat crown decreases. Now, I mentioned this last week, and several people commented variously about wanting to be able to knit hats that fit, and some wanted to know more about how to make interesting hat crowns like they'd seen, like with the swirls on them. So in case you were not aware, I have done a couple of videos on hats previously. One is how to measure a head for a hat. And then I have a full tutorial, it's about 20 to 22 minutes long, on how to knit a hat without a pattern. In addition, I have written articles for Interweave on how to knit a hat from stash yarn, so you can read about it in print, as well as an article on various ways to knit the crown of a hat. My video series is going to include more options than what I could include in the article. But if you want to get started on some hat knitting now and you're wondering how to improve the fit of a hat, or really how to go about measuring it, those are all going to be great resources, and I will leave those down in the show notes. Last week, I was talking about my next sort of big long-term project that I am planning to do, and that is going to be sort of on the evolution of sock construction. And I said some things I was thinking about last week, like, I don't think I'm going to do stockings. I don't really need stockings. They take a long time to knit. I'm really more interested in just looking at the sock aspect of it. Because socks did exist in the 19th century, mostly for men. So I've been thinking more about it, and also reading comments that people have had on that video, but also just in other videos, and kind of seeing what people are talking about or that are curious about. And I realized I really need to do a little bit more with the sock project than I was originally thinking. And the reason is that I was just going to skip over all of the stuff that I already know and just look at all of the new stuff. And I realized that I'm in a very different place in terms of my base knowledge with this sock project than I was when I started the sweater project. So the two things I knit the most are sweaters and socks. I know a lot about construction methods for both of them, all the different techniques and stuff. But when I started that sweater project, which I didn't intend to start, I had no familiarity at all with vintage and antique patterns. I knew very little about how sweaters were actually constructed at that time. I had a lot of false knowledge, things that I had been told about knitting back then, and that turned out to be completely wrong, or only right in certain circumstances. So as I started really diving into sweater patterns and noticing the techniques that were being used that were similar to things that we would use today, but maybe different versions, that was when I started to wonder, well, how did that how did we shift from using those, like having those be the common techniques, to what we use today? Like, how did that change over time? And so I was looking for knitting manuals. That's how I collected a lot of the vintage books that I have on my shelves right now, is because I was looking for actual knitting manuals that were instructing knitters on how to knit and how to do different techniques, not just looking at patterns. And because of that, these books are talking about techniques in general, and techniques can be applied to any type of garment or accessory. They're not limited to one type of thing. And so one of the techniques that I was noticing was done differently in sweaters 120 years ago was short rows. There were a couple of short row techniques that I was familiar with, but I think of it as being very basic and simple, and not, it's like the easiest way to do that. And we tend to apply what's called a short row technique when we turn for a short row, like wrap and turn is what was really common when I learned short rows. Like, you couldn't find a pattern that didn't specify wrap and turn short rows. And gradually, through the internet and independent designing, you will see instructions on how to make substitutions. You'll just see patterns with all kinds of short row techniques included in them. And so things are different now. But what I was noticing was that there were no wrap and turn short rows back then. And I'm like, when did that happen? Like, what was going on? And I started to wonder, well, for socks that had a short row heel, what would the short row technique have been? And so I started hunting down, well, where are some actual examples of socks with short row heels? Because heel flap and gusset construction was the most common method. And so I was looking and looking, and I found some really early sock patterns with short row heels, and it was not a short row technique that was used in the sweater patterns. It seemed to be very specific for socks, and they all used that technique. Nobody was using wrap and turn. So that became something I became very curious about, is when did the wrap and turn thing happen? What happened to this other method of short row shaping for short row sock heels? And, just what was going on there? So I learned a lot about sock construction, and from reading all of that in these past few years. What I decided I'm going to do, though, is actually look at some of the sock books. Like, there's one called Weldon's Practical Stocking Knitter. Weldon's was a monthly publication that began in the early 1880s. Every month there was a focus on a particular type of needlework. It might be knitting, it might be crochet, it might be tatting, it might be something else. And in the first year that Weldon's was published, 2 of the issues were devoted to stocking knitting. Interweave, a few years back, decided to collect some of those early Weldon's issues, and then they digitized them. And for a while, you could get them in hard copy form, but you can still get them in digitized format. Interweave doesn't have the rights to them anymore. Piecework does. But I will leave a link down below. But the very first issue of Weldon's Practical Stocking Knitter included sort of the formula for how to knit a stocking, and then a bunch of different options for heels and toes. And so that is something I'm thinking of exploring. I didn't really want to knit a pair of stockings. I don't have any use for a pair of stockings. It's a lot of knitting. And then I realized, well, the goal here is to learn some things and to see how things worked and how they fit. And so I only have to knit one stocking. Like, for a lot of these things, I only have to knit one of them. I think for some of the heels and toes, I will knit partial socks. I have a lot of hand knit socks, so it's not like I need a bunch more. But I will give resources for the sources that I'm using, and Weldon's Practical Stocking Knitter will be one of them. Some of the comments I saw were that people kind of wanted to knit along with me, like when I'm exploring a particular pattern and examining the construction and deciphering what's going on and figuring things out, that some people wanted to be able to do that as well. So it won't be any sort of formal knit along, but that is something that's going to be coming up. So I've been thinking about all this, and I was ordering some yarn in order to make these socks and stockings. And I got a text message from a friend of mine in the Knitters Guild, and he was saying that he had a really good friend who learned a very specific method of heel turn from an elderly relative in Norway, and that she died years ago, and his friend cannot figure out how that heel is constructed, and would I mind helping? And I said, sure. And I assumed that I would be able to look at it and tell her what it was and you know, point her to a resource, and we'd be on our way. And I said, you know, just have her send me photographs of the heel so I can see it from all the angles. And a couple of days later, she emailed me, and she sent me a photo of the sock, and she talked about kind of the general construction method of this sock. And at first, I couldn't even tell what I was looking at. Like, it was such a odd looking heel from the angle that she had sent. And then I started thinking about it. I'm like, oh, I know what this is. My assumption was it was what was called the common heel or the square heel. And this is the very first heel that is featured in Weldon's Practical Stocking Knitter. It's the type of heel that would have been taught to children when they were first learning to knit stockings, because it was such a simple heel. And then they would have probably learned one or two other types of heels eventually, but that would have been the first method that they learned. She had, had talked about how the heel was worked, and that her relative had never cut the yarn when she finished the heel. Like, she never cut it from the time she cast on until she finished the sock off. There's just the two ends to weave in, and the way that she finished the heel was not from grafting, but it looked like grafting. And I looked at the photograph and I'm like, yeah, it does look like grafting. I'm like, well, show me what the inside looks like. And so she sent me a photograph of the inside, and then I was like, I have no idea what this is. This is fascinating. And so I was at home Wednesday night trying a few different things, and I could not figure out what was going on. And I thought maybe what I was seeing in the photograph wasn't what was really there, because sometimes the angle or the way the light hits can make things seem one way and they're not really that way. And I said, you know, could we meet up somewhere, and can you bring the socks? Do you mind if I like poke and prod at it so I can kind of see what's really going on? So we met at a coffee shop yesterday, and she was able to find a second pair of socks as well, because the first pair was really dark gray and kind of a hairy yarn, so it's kind of hard to see in the photos. So she brought another pair that was a lighter gray and a much smoother yarn. And I'm like, sure enough, everything that I saw in that photograph was what the reality was. And I was poking closer and closer, and then I realized, oh, this isn't a common heel. This is what's called a manufacturer's heel. It's very similar, but there is a little bit of shaping along the heel. Well, I will go to the overhead and I'll kind of explain what's going on, and I'll show you the sock, because we'd been there for about an hour, and I was poking, I was trying to think, I was questioning her about what she could remember from like 25 years ago. And I was like, could I take one of them home? And so I could really like take close-up photos or really, you know, look at it under the light. And she said, sure. Because I mean, these are socks that this relative knit for her, and it's like precious. So I brought it home, and I have like this foot mannequin. So I put it on the foot mannequin, and that really helped me to really be able to see in 3 dimensions what was going on. And I tried and tried and tried last night. And I went to bed. I was so frustrated. And I was Googling everything I could think of. I was, you know, trying to, you know, looking up other sock techniques, like traditional Norwegian sock techniques, nothing like this, other methods of working this type of common heel. couldn't find anything. And I went to bed last night and I said to my husband, I just know I'm going to wake up at 3 in the morning and I'm going to be thinking about this sock heel and I'm going to have some great idea about, oh, I know how it's going to work, and I won't be able to get back to sleep, and I'll come up to my office and I will be wrong about it. Sure enough, I woke up at 3 in the morning. I came upstairs. I thought, I'm going to look at this one more time, because I did have an idea about it had to have been done on the wrong side of the work, and it has to have this one, had to be the process, but how did that work? How did that work? And I was poking at it. I'm like, yeah, I'm confirmed. I confirmed that. And then I thought, well, what if I forget about the fact that this is on a sock and then it was done in Norway? If I was just going to look up this, if I was going to try to describe this technique, and if I was going to look it up, what would I Google? What would I search for? And then I was able to find a website that had something that looked very promising. And after some experimentation, I got the result. So let's go to the overhead and I will show you what the sock looks like up close. Then I will explain to you what I was finally able to figure out about this and why I had such trouble understanding what I was seeing in this sock. So this is the sock. It looks like a pretty basic sock, and this is the sock heel. So I mentioned that I thought when I first saw the photographs, I thought I knew what kind of heel it was, and I thought it was this common heel. So when you knit a sock cuff down, you're knitting a tube in the round till you get to the ankle, and then you put half of the stitches that are for the top of the foot, you put those on hold. And the other half of the stitches, it becomes the heel flap. So you end up knitting something that looks like this. Once you have finished knitting the length of the heel flap, then you have to do what's called turning in the heel, so that you can turn the corner and then knit in this direction. So for a heel flap construction, often that turn just happens down at the bottom and becomes like a little triangle, or there's some kind of shaping that goes on. And then you end up picking up stitches up the side of one flap, up the edge of one side of the flap, and then you knit across the stitches that were on hold. You pick up stitches down the side of the flap, and then you can just kind of knit in the round. This type of heel is knit a little bit differently. So the common heel, you just knit completely down flat, and then you typically would end it in one of three ways. The way that they would have taught little children would have been just bind off the stitches and then sew it shut. And so then the bottom of the heel just, ends up right here. It's just the heel flap ends up rolling completely around. There is no actual turn. It's just this straight edge. So another way that you could close it would be to graft it. You'd have to cut the yarn and then you would graft it. So if you bound off, you would bind off and then you'd have to cut the yarn. If you graft, you cut the yarn and then you graft. But a third method that you could use would be the 3-needle bind off. And so the way that works is you would be working halfway across the right side of the work. Then you would fold the heel in half. So you would have half the stitches on one needle and the other half that wouldn't have been knit yet. And you fold them so that the wrong side is facing you. And then you can work the stitches together. So you work one stitch off each needle together and then work the next stitch off each needle together. And then you have two on a third needle and then you bind off, work them together, bind off. So that you are joining them together and binding off at the same time. And when you get to the end, you don't have to cut the yarn. So my assumption was, well, she probably just used a 3-needle bind off, but here's the thing. If you look at this heel, it looks grafted. It does not look like a 3-needle bind off. The stitches, this column of stitches just keeps going right across here in a straight line. If it were a 3-needle bind off, you would see kind of that seam ditch. And there would be kind of an offset when you look at stitches coming, this column of stitches right here, then it comes offsets by half a stitch and goes over there. So you would have this offset. And what you would see on the inside would be, you would see a bind off chain right here. It's kind of rolled a little bit on its side. And it's a little bit of a ridge. It's not too bad, but there is a little bit of a ridge, and then there's this column of chain stitches. And like I said, there's this seam ditch right here. So let's look at what the inside of the sock looks like. There are two parallel lines of chains, not one. And if you pull them apart a little bit, you can see that there's kind of that zigzag of stitches at the top. So you'd think, oh, well, they were bound off and then just kind of sewn together like grafting, but they're not. If you touch it, it's very flat. It's not the same as binding off and sewing it together. I was stumped. I'm poking, I'm prodding, I'm trying to figure it out. I couldn't figure it out. Once I realized this for sure, these were bound off and these were bound off, and they were somehow bound off simultaneously in parallel. And I thought, well, if I don't think about this in terms of a sock, just in terms of what's going on here, I'm going to look up a parallel bind off. And what I found was one called a double bind off. The source that I found for it was using it as a decorative way of joining two pieces of a shawl. And so you can see that there are these two chains here, but this was done on the right side of the work because it's meant to be decorative and it's kind of above the surface of the fabric. But one of the things that happened when I was doing this was that I had the memory of those actions that I was performing. And so I knew I had done it before, I had seen it before, and I started thinking about it, and I realized I had seen it in the context of the right side of the work before, and that's why I had such difficulty recognizing what it was, because this is a highly decorative, very visible way of joining fabric from the right side of the work. But if you look at it here, it's invisible from the right side of the work, and it's very flat on the wrong side of the work. So it's such a different use and a different appearance that I just didn't recognize it. Once I realized I had seen this bind off before, I knew where I had seen it and in what context. I had seen it in this book, Knitting in the Old Way, which is designs and techniques from ethnic sweaters, and it was the Cowichan sweater. And when I looked it up in here it is, the unique Cowichan shoulder join, double bind off shoulder join using 3 needles. So I recognized these, and I knew I'd done it before, but it was such a different context. So I'm going to show you guys how this works. So if we pretend that all of these stitches were the heel flap that we were knitting back and forth, we would, on a right side row, knit across half of the stitches, and then we would turn so that they were facing each other. So the wrong sides are facing out. You get a 3rd needle, and you're going to, even though these look like purl stitches, we're going to knit those. So I'm going to put the yarn in my left hand. So I'm going to knit this stitch. So it's on the needle. Now, this is the trick. This is the thing I never would have figured out on my own. Now you rotate the needle so it's this way. And then you purl this stitch. So we're just doing the setup right now. We're going to have, now we have 2 stitches on the needle. We're going to turn this 3rd needle back toward. So now we're going to knit a 2nd one from this side. So now we have 3 stitches on the needle. These were both the knit stitches, and that one was the purl. So we're going to pass this middle stitch over the stitch that I just worked. So now there's 2 stitches back on the needle. Once again, I'm going to rotate this back this direction so that I can purl a stitch this time. And so this yarn is going to be stranding across the front of this one. So now I've purled that stitch, I'm going to pass this one over. So that's the whole process, is that you just keep rotating the needle around and working one stitch off one needle, passing the center one over, rotating this back to this direction so that you can purl this one, pass that one over. And if we look at what we have so far, you can see I've got those parallel stitches on this side. And then on this side, it looks like it was grafted. It's pretty amazing. I'm curious if any of you have ever used this technique, whether you've used it in this way or in the decorative sense, like for a Croatian sweater or for some other kind of decorative join. If you'd like to join me in knitting a pair of stockings or even just one stocking from Weldon's Practical Stocking Knitter, you can get a copy of the publication from the link down below. I'll be knitting a number of things from Weldon's and would love to see some of your efforts too as I work through the various techniques. Next week is Thanksgiving, which I'll be spending with my extended family, so I won't be posting a Casual Friday episode next week, but I will be back the following week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.